Alrighty. Hey, everybody who's watching this live or tuning in later. Welcome to the sixth and final installment of the Green New Deal for Portland series. Today, we're going to be talking a lot about transportation policy and upcoming campaigns to support. Your co-facilitators for the day will be Cassie Wilson, who is a transportation policy manager at Thousand Friends of Oregon, who's pictured in the box next to me. And then Aaron Brown, who's a transportation policy director for Oregon Representative Confam, will join us shortly as well and jump in. So yeah, I'll be monitoring the chat tonight. So if folks have questions as we're going, feel free to put them in. And Cassie, do you prefer to take questions as you're going? Do you like to wait for a pause? How do you have a preferred way of doing that?
I think we'll have a couple spots in our presentation where I can check in and see if there have been questions.
Okay, great. So I'll pass it over to Cassie and we'll get going. And they're gonna lead the session today. And if we have a little bit of time over, we can chat about other stuff, but primarily we'll be doing transportation policy today. So take it away, Cassie.
Thanks, Nick. Let me get my screen going here. I think we're good. Let me hide all the Zoom stuff that's in the way. Also, somebody let me know when Aaron gets here. I've got all my screens going, but cannot see the room. So just let me know. Yes, hello everyone. Thank you, Nick, for inviting me and Aaron to present about this. It's very timely and yeah, just excited to get to be part of this. I attended the Breach Collective Green New Deal training series a couple years ago in the height of COVID, and it was very informative. So excited to be part of this one. Something I was thinking about reflecting back on the other trainings I've listened to in this series so far was how hard it is to build a new world within the existing one. Particularly thinking about that as, you know, Aaron's driving back from legislative days in Salem, and as I keep accidentally working a bunch of overtime because we're constantly in a state of having to respond to what's going on in the current world in terms of we'll be talking tonight a lot about the state legislature and state transportation policy. And so a lot of the organizing happening right now, we're constantly having to wait on information to come out from the state legislature. And so it's like we can be trying as much as we want to work in advance of things and to have equitable engagement and all of the things we're trying so hard to do, but it's made so much harder in a world that's straight up not designed for it. So yeah, give yourselves grace. Hope you will give us grace as we are navigating a very busy time in transportation policy. All right, this is unintentionally a slide of a bunch of pictures of Cassie. As Nick said, I'm the transportation policy manager at 1000 Friends of Oregon. I've been here about a month, and before that have been involved in transportation justice organizing over the past few years, having gotten involved with Sunrise PDX's Youth First ODOT campaign. As somebody who I actually live outside of Portland right now, I live in Boring. And so a lot of my transportation experiences have been shaped by living in Clackamas County, particularly in an area that has no access to transit or other ways to get around besides driving or being driven. And also as somebody who just cares a lot about climate and making sure that that we have a livable future. The 2020 wildfires really moved me in terms of realizing that the impacts of climate change are already here. And so that's when I got involved in Sunrise and learned that transportation accounts for 40% of emissions, and what that means for the future. And then, yeah, when he gets here, we'll be joined by Aaron, who I'll let him introduce himself more when he gets here. So tonight we're gonna give a little bit of context about how we got to where we're at, both in terms of the transportation system we have today, the historic inequities that it has caused, and also how we ended up here today in terms of where we're at going into this big time of transportation policy at the state level. And we're going to talk about a bunch of fun and cool and interesting policy ideas for what a Green New Deal for transportation in Oregon could look like. A lot of them are things that other states have already done and are absolutely possible. And so that's the type of stuff that gets me really excited and motivated. And then we'll talk a bit about how we can make that vision come to life, both in the next year and beyond, and how you can get involved. So I unsurprisingly am a huge transportation nerd, and I think the history of transportation, especially locally, is fascinating, although it honestly is pretty similar in states across the US. So the image on the left is a map of what used to be the electric interurban railways in Portland and the Willamette Valley. So Portland's kind of in the top middle of the map, and then Eugene is the city at the bottom. This is what our transportation system used to be like. And so anytime people are like, rural public transportation can't happen, I'm like, you're wrong, because we had it in the early 1900s. And so that juxtaposed to the picture on the top right, which is the where the I-5 was being constructed in the 60s, in terms of dividing neighborhoods, particularly Black and low-income neighborhoods, in half. And this, was not unique to Portland in any way. This was happening in cities across the U.S. And so it's like as freeways and as cars were being pushed as the primary mode of transportation, the railways that you see in the map on the left started to go away, and we started to lose transportation options. And so now we're at a place in time where it's more like the bottom pictures, where we've got the MAX system that is not anywhere near as built out as what we had in the early 1900s. And we have roads like 82nd Avenue that we're having to put a lot of work into bringing up to a state of livability and safety that actually works for people outside of cars, because these are roads that have been managed by the state for a long time, but are really main roads, main streets in the city, where people are walking, biking, taking transit, and they should be actually safe and usable for people doing those things, people outside of a car, rather than just moving cars through as quickly as possible. So the city of Portland now has control over the Portland portion of 82nd Avenue, which is very exciting. And there are a lot more roads like it around the state that need to undergo the same thing, including in the city, in terms of Powell Boulevard. And I mean, every time I go to work, I'm crossing 99. And so these state highways are really everywhere. And but there are cities' main streets, and haven't been treated as such historically. So a lot of conversations about how to make changes there. As I mentioned earlier, 40% of our emissions come from transportation. We obviously need to decarbonize across all sectors. And we have huge goals around cutting emissions in half by 2030, which, we need to be moving as quickly as possible across all sectors. And so we need to be thinking about not just electrification, but um, how do we get how do we reduce the amount people are driving in general? Because even if we electrify everything as fast as possible, that's still not going to meet everybody's transportation needs or solve all of our problems quickly enough, because we know that a lot of people cannot afford an electric vehicle or can't drive or don't want to drive to begin with. And um, so there's multiple approaches. I think a common narrative we hear is, well, who cares if we widen the freeway, because the cars will be electric someday anyway. But that's just not not the case for people who can't just go out and buy a new electric vehicle. So as I was saying, reducing vehicle miles traveled is a huge part of that. How can we make it so people are driving less? Obviously, public transportation, active transportation are huge ways to do that more efficiently, especially in a city like Portland. It's absolutely possible. And something I think a lot about is people like me and Aaron talk a lot about induced demand, which is, I think we have a slide on it later on, but it's basically the concept that if you build it, they will come. If you build more lanes, there will be more cars to fill those lanes. It will not solve congestion. But the same is true for good forms of transportation infrastructure too. If you build a bus that's actually feasible to take and comes frequently, more people are going to use it than if you make a bus system where it only comes once an hour and it's really hard to plan your life around it. And if you make safe bike and pedestrian infrastructure, people are going to be more likely to use it than if they're having to walk along the shoulder of a busy road. So there's a lot that can be done to reduce VMT still at this point. And so making investments in those other modes is absolutely necessary. And, pushing back on the narrative that the greenest way to get around, being an electric car, it's like there's really nothing more green than sharing modes of transportation that either require no power at all in terms of walking or biking, or modes of transportation like public transit, where it's just more energy efficient in general. Let's see, what else was I gonna say on this? I think that was it on this slide. So a big part of what I think about in my work at 1000 Friends, and for people who aren't familiar, I think hopefully some of you saw my boss's presentation earlier in the series, but 1000 Friends is a land use advocacy organization. And so something I'm thinking a lot about from the transportation perspective is, how do we make it so people aren't having to travel as far in the first place to get where they need to go? How do we make it so that way people can actually afford to live where they work, And I mean, just generally live in the communities where they want to be spending their time and are spending their time. So that way they're not having to commute an hour across town by whatever mode of transportation it is. And so, um, you know, we need to be promoting changes in our land use system that support making denser, more affordable communities possible in terms of transit oriented development, making sure that there's, if we're going to have like an awesome frequent bus or max line, making sure that people can like live right there, walking distance, biking distance, to be able to get to transit and use it. There's no reason that we should still be building affordable housing next to freeways, and yet that is still something that is happening all of the time, and it's clearly an intentional choice because who wants to live to a gross polluting freeway? um I see Aaron has joined the slides. Is he on the call yet?
Yeah, he's in here. I'll promote him to host in just a second.
Sweet, thank you. um So yeah, that, and then I guess the other thing I'm thinking about, especially as we are thinking about the future, is the housing and transportation connection in general hasn't been made a lot in policy spaces in the past. And so something I'm thinking a lot about is you know, the need for the state to make investments in land banking, like making sure that and also preservation, like making sure that people who live in communities that are getting investments in their transit systems, making sure that they can afford to stay there and enjoy those improvements and not be priced out. And also, like, transit and walkable, bikeable communities should be so abundant that it's not like an extra price tag to have to get to live somewhere that has transportation options. It should be so abundant that you're not getting priced out for actually having your transportation needs met. Aaron, are you on? I can't see.
I am on, and ditto everything Cassie said. You also just listened to everything she said. She's brilliant and an expert. Aaron Brown, he, they pronouns. Thanks for everyone's patience. I was just getting back from Salem, had to drive and get stuck in traffic because we do not have frequent passenger rail service. I work for Representative Pham in the state legislature, soon to be a senator, which is really exciting. Representative Pham is on the Joint Committee on Transportation. I'm looked over the slides that we've already gone through so far, so I don't want to repeat anything that Cassie said, but you know, Representative Pham has been a really huge champion of the notion that we need to be approaching all of our projects through a climate justice lens, whether it be thinking of economic development through jobs or whether that be thinking about reducing carbon emissions. And I joined right when Cassie was right on my favorite slide, which is that Green New Deal one that we just passed over. Yeah.
Feel free to add on.
I have nothing to add that Cassie didn't already say. I think that this is a mantra. I spend my spare time outside of working for Representative Pham, also on the board of Portland Neighbors Welcome, which is a zoning reform, housing abundance advocacy organization. And this right here to me is just where transportation, climate, and housing all intersect. We have to be looking at every level of government, local, regional, state, and just rejiggering some of the status quo patterns in which cities decide, no, we don't want affordable housing nearby, and in which the state decides, no, too bad, local city, we're gonna ram a big road down your community and not add, you know, bus stops or have service be frequent. And at every level of government, just finding ways to tinker with changing it so that we have walkable neighborhoods where the bus shows up every 5 minutes, that has housing for all different families of every age, wage, and stage. That's kind of one of our phrases: ages, wages, and stages. And so I'm going to pass it over to Cassie to go to the next slide. But thank you all for your patience and happy to be here.
Thanks, Aaron. So expanding on some of those historic inequities that I mentioned earlier, yeah, I mean, if you live next to a freeway, if you work or go to school next to a freeway, you are constantly being exposed to air and noise pollution. And even if it's not a freeway, some of these other roads like 82nd Avenue, that, you know, are former state highways or current state highways, aren't much better. And that takes its toll, whether it's in increased cases of asthma or otherwise. There are constantly studies being done on the impacts of living next to these toxic, polluting transportation facilities. The map on the right is a map of the city's tree canopy, and it's like really interesting how you can like clearly see where certain major roads are based on where there are not trees, and what that means for urban heat islands. For those who maybe either weren't in the area or just aren't familiar with it, a few years ago when we had that really major heat wave of like 100 and what was it 117 degrees, there were parts of Portland that were dramatically hotter or cooler than that based on their tree canopy, based on how much asphalt is in the area. And so it's like all of those things are contributing factors. And clearly Southwest Portland has lots and lots and lots of trees, whereas East Portland does not. And you can clearly see like where industrial areas are as well, because there's basically no greenery in those areas. Additionally, hostile architecture. I'm sure most of us are familiar with that around Portland, whether it's benches that are uncomfortable to literally anybody because they're designed to prevent houseless folks from sleeping on them, or the lack of public restrooms. I think about that all the time as a transit rider. I'm like, the fact that every transit center doesn't have a restroom is absurd to me. And just generally, like, our public spaces are not often spaces where folks are able to hang out for very long because they don't want people loitering around. So it's like anti homeless like policies are anti everyone policies, really, because I don't know, I just think it's absurd and makes taking transit or walking or biking so much more difficult and uncomfortable. And also, even just it, like when you visit Northwest Portland, like there's suddenly a bunch of benches everywhere and parks and greenery, and it's very nice. And then if you like go to the east side, you're like, I can't find a garbage can or a bench or anything. So very, very different depending which parts of the city you're in as to what infrastructure you get, which is obviously not great. And then similarly with traffic violence, the people who are affected by it, it's disproportionately people of color, disabled people, lower income people, houseless people. And it's typically in their neighborhoods. It's on these major roads that don't have good infrastructure, or that are near freeways. But generally, oftentimes on roads controlled by the state. We call them orphan highways because they're being neglected and just, yeah, aren't up to where they need to be for what they are today. And then additionally, like, you know, we've built out this system that is so based around driving, yet a quarter of the state's population can't or doesn't drive. Like, if you just look at how many people in Oregon have a driver's license and how many people there are in Oregon, a quarter of the state doesn't have a license. And so, yes, that includes youth, that includes older adults, people who just straight up don't want to drive, can't afford to drive, or otherwise. And where was I going with that? Aaron, thoughts? Sorry, my brain, it's been a long day, y'all.
No, you got it. I think the really integral part that Cassie's really getting at here is just recognizing, once you start to see all of the ways that our society, our built form, our economy, our culture, our society is predicated on the assumption that any movement is happening in an automobile, a privately owned automobile that is operated by somebody, and you recognize just what enormous subsidies and sacrifices and compromises we're making in that, you know, you can't unsee it. And then the more you start seeing it, the more you see exactly how it overlaps with racial justice, with climate justice, with disability justice. I see a comment in the chat. I don't know, are we taking comments, questions now, or do we want to wait till the end? I don't know what the protocol is.
Well, I guess since you can see it, if you want to manage that, because
Sure.
I can't see nothing.
That question is from Samuel Garcia. He says, how do you balance dense walkable communities with limiting proximity to air and noise pollution? Does density correlate to more pollution? That's a great question. And, you know, I think there's something happening right now where when we build really low density, single detached home sprawl, or, you know, less density stuff, we have the same amount of pollution. It's just concentrated on these busy arterials where, you know, folks of lesser means end up living, right? And, you know, noise pollution, just one thing, just switching to, I mean, a lot of our presentation today is about how saying that, you know, electric vehicles in of itself does not solve the climate crisis, right? But I do think that in the next 5 to 10 years, as we switch to cities that have a lot more electric vehicles, I think we're all going to be shocked as to how much noise we put up with based on living in communities where all the automobiles were much louder. And although that does not solve the air pollution, a lot of the automobiles, even if they are electric, they're still polluting substantial air pollution coming from the tires, a lot of the microplastics, some of the studies that have been in the air in the news the last couple of weeks. So I guess I'll table speaking more into the question for now, just to get to the rest of the presentation. But I think I guess the short answer to that is to say that you know, we currently are concentrating the pollution that does happen in very specific areas where we have only allowing specific people to live and to work. And there's a way in which by A, building communities that are free of internal combustion engines, and B, you know, better design of our housing and location, you know, there are ways to mitigate what the impact is to every individual person, while also having a much better outcome than what we currently have, which is some people have little and a lot of people are dealing with a lot.
Yeah, and I think I would add too that it's like if we're building more dense walkable communities, then ideally less people are having to drive in those communities. And so hopefully there's less pollution in that case. Aaron, you want to take this one?
Sure. So the fine folks at the Rocky Mountain Institute have put together this nerdy little calculator that looks at every state's demographics and kind of computes out, you know, what would it look like if we did build communities where the average Oregonian was able to drive 20% less? And while obviously we would be very ecstatic for that for a lot of quality of life, good urbanism, climate issues, there are so many other ways that we can really look at this. And the second stat in particular, the $1,400, the average annual household savings, you know, reducing car dependency is an anti-poverty initiative. I'm going to say that again because I think it's really, really critical. Reducing car dependency is an anti-poverty initiative. Building communities where people don't have to spend thousands of dollars on gasoline, on maintenance, on insurance, on depreciation, on time stuck in congestion, on what the adverse health impacts of that are, they are significant. You know, we talked previously about traffic fatalities and the impacts of air quality. Those additional stats show that, you know, it's costing Oregonians 500 people or it costs the state of Oregon 500 deaths every year because we have so much air pollution, because we have so much traffic violence on our streets. These are preventable tragedies that, you know, when we talk about how cheap it is to drive, or when we talk about what the policy impacts and trade-offs are, this is the way that we subsidize our automobiles, is by, you know, having vulnerable deaths that don't need to happen in our community. So really just love trying to encourage people to look at the big picture quantitative impacts of that. Want to move to the next slide? Cassie, you put these together. Do you want to talk about some of these?
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight some examples of local transportation issues. It's actually transportation is an interesting thing, and I guess this is maybe true for every issue, but I'm just so often, unfortunately, thinking about how often we're having to fight against things we don't want to see happen, and how rare it is that we get to fight for things we want, which we'll get to talk more about later. But there's a lot of bad stuff happening right now in terms of continued freeway plans. The I-5 Rose Quarter being one of the big ones. I think, what's the price tag up to now? Almost $2 billion.
Yes.
Yeah. And just absolutely nowhere near having the money to build it, which is good. But that one's an interesting one where it's like, well, we would love to see justice for the albino community in terms of part of that project is proposing putting caps over the freeway to help reknit the community back together. But you can do that without widening the freeway and save a bunch of money in the process. So that's been a several years long fight that continues. In the Park Rose Argay Terrace neighborhood, there is a trucking facility that is currently being proposed to be put in right by Park Rose schools, which would, cause a lot more air pollution, a lot more safety concerns for all the students who cross the road there. And so that's another example of a current local issue that folks are organizing around. And then I just put another picture of they're also known as stroads. It's basically these 5-lane arterials that are just so wide and so dangerous as a pedestrian. And so just ongoing conversations about that. But I will say, I guess 82nd is also an example though of like where like the community was successful and where there are plans being done to make it safer and to improve transit on the corridor and stuff. So that has shifted to like there's positive things happening there. And then I was thinking the other day, because of that train that derailed on the steel bridge, I'm just thinking about how, and related to a lot of the work that Nick does, just in terms of like, we've got oil trains just like driving through town all the time, and that's wild to me because we hear about train derailments all the time, and like it's just a matter of time before that like horrendously impacts Portland. And so just a little taste of what's going on, and the vast array of issues, from mega projects to more of the transportation land use intersections of what's allowed in our neighborhoods. Aaron, you want to take this one?
Yeah, I mean, this lovely little GIF does it for me. For anyone who does not already know, the funny and wild thing about spending billions of dollars to add extra lanes to freeways, it doesn't actually work. There isn't a single freeway anywhere in the history of North America that by adding additional lanes, suddenly congestion was solved. This is due to a concept called induced demand, which is to say that like the more lanes you add, the easier it is for more people to consider driving. The more people will consider driving at those peak hours, and suddenly the road is back at peak congestion. There are definitely, opportunities to explore doing something different involving tolling and congestion pricing. That's a whole other equity conversation we can have at a separate time or afterwards if people have questions. But it's just really integral for us to just recognize that, there's an inertia, there's a status quo. It's true in Oregon, it's true of state DOTs across the country. There's a very powerful freeway industrial complex that's comprised of real estate, suburban real estate, oil, asphalt, construction, sometimes labor unions. There's a very big cabal that understands infrastructure is a very particular type of thing that we build, and it's roads. I deliberately call it a freeway industrial complex in homage to a prison industrial complex type in which we have this depressingly predictable bipartisan coalition that continues to churn the same solution, despite the fact that over the last 50 to 70 years, it's never actually solved any of our problems. And in fact, it has laid the burdens and benefits in disproportionate or in depressingly predictable ways across lines of race, class, and gender, right? It's actually the same companies that build prisons are often the ones that are running these massive freeway projects. And in fact, these freeway projects are often built through the formerly Black neighborhoods at which many of those grandchildren now are in those prisons, right? Like there's a direct link into like how this massive multi-billion-dollar infrastructure is shaping and engaging communities throughout multiple generations. And we have to find, and the state is not just complicit in it, the state is actively continuing to perpetuate this. And anytime that there's efforts to change that is often being, greenwashed and equity washed, and find other ways to sort of mitigate what is still actually happening here. And so Cassie and I, in different roles, in me working with Representative Pham, her with 1,000 Friends of Oregon, and in different advocacy spaces, have been trying to find ways to chip away at that and really propose an alternative, which I'm excited that we're going to be able to talk about. Can we move to the next slide? And we can go through this one briefly. Oh, I added extra photos.
Sorry, yeah, I think I started sharing before you added pictures. My bad.
That's totally fine. The photos, imagine on the left, there's a photo of a big gnarly freeway. And then imagine on the right, there's a photo of a lovely walkable neighborhood. And imagine on that photo on the left, when you see like all that asphalt, you're thinking about the impermeable surface, you're thinking about the urban heat island effect, you're thinking of the pollution. And then in the other one where there's this leafy, there's trees, there's buses, there's housing of multiple layers. I think that like when we talk about that vision of what dense walkable communities with affordable and abundant housing connected by frequent and reliable transit, when we're spending billions of dollars on this other thing, if we have to stop the gray old deal if we want to find the funding and resources and political support for the Green New Deal. And it is my life's work is to figuring out how to do that within the confines of community organizing and electoral and politics. Shifting to the next slide is actually a good image of how Cassie and I met, which is through getting involved with Sunrise's Youth vs. ODOT campaign. Cassie, do you want to talk about that a bit?
Yeah, so now that time flies, Aaron, how long were we protesting outside?
It was about a full year. It started April 2021 through about July of 2022, I think.
Yeah. Every other week we were outside the Oregon Department of Transportation in downtown Portland, protesting all the freeway expansions, really, because we wanted to see there be sustainable transportation options, not more of the gray old deal, as Aaron said. And also just making the explicit climate transportation connection. I feel like there was actually a lot of education that happened through this campaign of just like growing the awareness that one, freeway expansions don't solve congestion, nor do they solve any of our transportation issues really. But also that they would make the climate crisis worse. And so, because there's always a lot of arguments about, well, if you stop congestion, then it'll pollute less if the cars are moving. People will give every argument they've got. But if you're adding more cars on the road, then there is ultimately going to be more emissions. And so, yeah, we connected with elected officials really at every level, including eventually we took our protest outside the governor's office because or the governor's house, I mean, because this was at a time when there was legislation around basically being able to, this is so wonky, so forgive me, but to bond against expected tolls to pay for freeways. So basically, they're like, we expect to raise this much money from tolls in the future, so therefore we can spend that much money on widening the freeway now. And so we were heavily protesting that. And after the legislature passed it, then we were asking the governor to veto it. We learned a lot about the legislative process through that, and also just how I think a lot about how our friend Ada would talk about how ridiculous it is that like we're in all these obscure government committee meetings giving testimony at 7 a.m. on summer break, because it's like the system is so purposefully convoluted and hard to engage with, which is what upholds the status quo. And kind of like as I was talking about at the very beginning of just like we're trying to build a better world within one that is actively not built for us to be engaged in a meaningful way. And so constantly having to go up against that, especially for, you know, a lot of the students who were involved in this campaign were in school. Ada would be in math class giving testimony, because community engagement is not, I mean, it's in the middle of the workday, it's in the middle of the school day, like it makes it impossible for folks to show up. So anyway, this particular picture is when we basically had a Halloween party outside of ODOT, and we told ghost stories about freeways and things. And it was very fun, because this work can be long and hard, but we certainly found ways to keep it entertaining. Aaron, anything you want to add?
No, mainly just that the rest of our presentation is going to be forward thinking about what the Green New Deal is. But I mean, I think many folks on this call, just knowing the various, what is the things you're playing offense on, what are the things you're playing defense on, that we need campaigns that's pointing out that, we shouldn't have fracked gas in our houses anymore. And also we need campaigns making it as easy as possible for people to install, heat pumps, right? And that these two campaigns often, we need both. Like we need the sticks and the carrots. And, sometimes we have different people that are speaking in each of those spaces. Sometimes it's the same people, just with different email addresses. But, it's really critical for us to be just recognizing the totality of, a lot of the No More Freeways work has been led through litigation as well as the community organizing. And, it takes a multi-pronged attack and kind of throw in the kitchen sink at saying, we need legislative strategy, we need legal litigative strategy, we need community organizing that's just getting television cameras. I would go to all of these meetings years ago and no one cares what I have to say about this stuff. But when you show up with an army of pissed off teenagers that are channeling their inner Greta Thunberg and really echoing, the existential threat that climate, represents, suddenly it gets on the news. It's a very different thing than when I do it, right? So, I like throwing that out there just to, as a moment to appreciate the intergenerational nature of climate activism. I think is something that we need to just honor more often. That No More Freeways has been its most successful collaborating with young folks and old folks. We've got some folks that know how to read a 400-page draft environmental impact statement and find the 4 lines of text where ODOT is lying about something. And also we've got folks that know how to have a really kick-ass Halloween party outside of ODOT and like smash a pumpkin and show up in costumes and sing songs, right? And there's roles for all of us to participate in that. And so I imagine all of the folks on this call are involved in this work in one way or another and have kind of thought about this stuff. But I like just sort of acknowledging that there's the best part about sort of the climate work is finding ways that everyone can contribute what their strengths are towards the larger effort. And now we get to talk about the fun stuff. Oh, no, go for it, Cassie.
I just want to echo that, because I think, getting my start like in this work through Sunrise, like has given me such an appreciation for the need for all of those different approaches, because now that I've been more in now that I'm in more like bureaucratic spaces, it's like it can be really easy for especially like people in positions of power or who have just like been upholding the status quo for a long time to be like, oh, just be nice, just come to the table, just play nice. But it's like, if like we need every single approach, because playing nice doesn't always get us where we want to be. And also like when you have people like pushing from the outside more to be like, we want this, that, and if it's like honestly the bigger and bolder it is, the better, because then it makes whatever other asks are happening. Like it can legitimize things that used to seem really bold and out there, and make them more possible. So it's like we need all the parts. So yeah. On to the future. Any other questions that have come up, Aaron, in the chat or elsewhere?
Not yet.
Okay. Do you want to set the scene for 2025, and then I can?
Yeah, let's move to the next slide. So yeah, as we've probably said multiple times, and you might have heard otherwise, ODOT is about to be broke. When Oregon passed, funny enough, the first gas tax in the country back in 1919. And then in 1945, during the war effort, there was when all of the other parts of state funding were getting siphoned off for war, the Oregon Highway Department helped pass rules saying, okay, all the money for the gas tax can only be spent on roads, which at the time makes sense. But that meant that we now have what is called the Highway Trust Fund, which is to say that we raise money through the gas tax. We have a user pays model. So ostensibly, this is not true anymore, but this is the theory, is that like our transportation system is paid for the people that are using it. All of the money is coming from the gas tax. And because we're switching to electric vehicles, because people are driving less, because people are driving more fuel efficient vehicles, revenue from the gas tax is going to decline, and it's going to continue declining. And on top of all of that, ODOT has spent so much money on big freeway projects over the past couple of years that they haven't really been addressing their backlog maintenance needs. So, and I throw ODOT under the bus, but honestly, the Oregon legislature is the one that has been telling ODOT what to spend the money on. So, you know, the Spider-Man meme where like Spider-Man's pointing at each other, like you have to think of the Oregon legislature and ODOT as kind of doing that same thing of just sort of being like, you know, I sometimes compare it to like a restaurant, like ODOT owns the restaurant and the legislature comes up and they look at the menu and there's only steak on the menu and they don't think to ask, hey, do you have anything else in the kitchen? Can you order a salad? And it's one of those where, you know, we need the legislature, we need ODOT to put salads on the menu and we need the legislature to ask for it if it's not on the menu. And until we get out of this, who's responsible for this and towards a like, okay, how are we going to collaboratively change this the better? So knowing that the gas tax is declining, we have to be figuring out what the new source of revenue is that's going to replace, you know, and that's going to be covering all of the backfield maintenance and safety needs, right? And as Cassie and I have, you know, shown in the last couple slides, like it can't just be cars anymore. We have to be thinking about better investments in transit. We have to be making sure that when we're doing the maintenance investments, there's the full slate, the top tier of safety improvements that are going along with it. We need to be thinking about passenger rail. Just the whole concept of transportation needs to be moving away from the notion that every Oregonian traveling is doing so in a single occupancy vehicle. And so that crisis of the funding becomes our opportunity to look at and explore alternatives.
And I think too, zooming out, because I think sometimes like being so deep in this work, like I forget that people don't even necessarily know like how transportation funding works in the first place. But I guess one good example is that with things like the gas tax, there's something called the 50-30-20 split, where 50% of it goes to the state, 30% goes to counties, and 20% goes to cities. And so that's like just one example of how state transportation legislation does trickle down to affect what our communities look like. And again, even those parts that are going to the state do affect our communities, because when ODOT owns the main roads going through our cities, then they're in charge of it, but except for they keep spending their money on bad things instead. But that is besides the well, that is kind of the point too. But what else did I want to say on this? Oh, I guess the main point being that from the state policy making level, yeah, it's a lot about the funding, it's a lot about the accountability mechanisms, and establishing programs and projects and things like that, versus like I know sometimes folks are like, what about this specific road or this specific very local thing? And so it's like some stuff, it's like the funding comes down from the state, but then it's locally implemented. And so it's like sometimes it's kind of knowing which lever to press on different issues. I put some slides in here about the last transportation package because I did a bunch of research on it for my internship last year. And because I think it serves as a good example of what's been done in the past here, in terms of, you know, the last time we were approaching a state transportation package, the state was talking about diversifying and stabilizing revenue streams, but they didn't actually do anything about the gas tax, really. They just increased it. They didn't even, they should have indexed it to inflation, but they didn't. But the good thing that came out of the last package is that most of the new funding streams went to things like transit and bike and pedestrian infrastructure. And so the funding mechanisms in the last package included a vehicle dealer privilege tax, which vehicle automobile dealerships like did try to argue in court and be like, this money has to go to roads, but the courts decided that because it's just about the ability to sell vehicles and it's not about owning and operating the vehicle, that it didn't have to go to roads. And so that actually funds electric vehicle rebates and off-roadway bike and pedestrian paths, because as Aaron was talking about earlier, there most of the gas tax and things like that has to go to things within the right of way, which has never included transit, which is really annoying because it's kind of just up for interpretation at that point. But and so any think of the Springwater Trail where it's bike and pedestrian infrastructure, but it's not directly like on the road like a bike lane is. So that created a good funding source for that, along with, unfortunately, the bike sales tax, which nobody loves, because we should be incentivizing and making it easier for people to have access to active transportation. And then it also included the payroll tax that funds transit. So it gave transit sustainable state funding for the first time ever. And that's been absolutely transformative across the state. And then it did also introduce the idea of value pricing or tolling or congestion pricing. It's been called so many different things since it was written into 2017. But as you may know, that is now on pause until at least 2026. So that's not a current way that we're funding transportation. And then, and then I guess I would also just say though that in addition to state funding for transportation, there are local mechanisms. So like for anyone familiar with the, oh my God, why did I just forget what PSEF stands for? Aaron.
Portland Clean Energy Fund.
Thank you. So like there's going to be transportation grants coming out through that. There's the city's gas tax that just passed for renewal and things like that. So there are also local ways that transportation funding is supplemented. And then these were some of the programs and projects that were in the last package. So obviously there was unfortunately a bunch of urban freeway projects named, and then there was actual dedicated money for safe routes to school infrastructure grants, which was huge because that does actually come from the gas tax. But because it comes from the gas tax, it has to be within the right of way, which is again where the program Oregon Community Paths that does the off-roadway bike and pedestrian infrastructure is important, because in some communities, maybe like a bike lane or whatever is not necessarily the best or most efficient way for people to get around outside of the car, and maybe it is some sort of trail that would more easily connect people. And so but either way, the Safe Routes to School funding has been incredibly important and is massively oversubscribed, meaning that there's way more demand for it than there is funding available. So Hopefully we can see that increase in this next package. Similarly, I mean, pretty much for every program that was created for transit and active transportation in 2017, they've just been hugely successful. You know, like who would have thought that when you invest in public and active transportation, there's really positive impacts. And so I think it's been really good in the sense that I don't think we need to entirely reinvent the wheel on the programs front moving forward for a lot of things, because it's already there. It just needs more money to keep being successful. There was also dedicated funding for operations and maintenance, particularly for small cities and counties in the state. And again, it was that, 50-30-20 split of making sure counties and cities have what they need to just continue to function as well. And then an interesting part about 2017 is it named a bunch of those state highways that should be transferred to cities or counties. But it didn't provide any funding to do that. And ODOT has to bring them up to a certain standard before they can be transferred. And so since then, there's been a committee created that will recommend 3 roads or facilities to the legislature every other year that should receive funding to be transferred. Because otherwise, it was always just kind of based on wherever the political momentum was around, like that's how 82nd Avenue got funding. There was a lot of political momentum around getting it out of the state's hands. And so now there'll be a more consistent long-term approach of making sure that we're moving in a direction of getting all the roads that need to be up to a better standard and out of the state's hands down that same path. But as Aaron was saying, ODOT's about to be out of money, and hasn't been spending money on transportation in a way that actually matches climate and equity and land use goals. It's like we can set all the goals we want about reducing emissions as a state, but if we keep investing in projects that are going to increase emissions, then we're not going to be making progress on those goals. And there's a lack of accountability. I guess one of my new go-to examples is that in the last Oregon Transportation Commission meeting, they were talking about wanting to take money from active and public transportation projects and just basic maintenance and operations projects around the state to fund freeway expansions in the Portland area. And part of it is that ODOT is still like statutorily obligated to keep pursuing these projects until the legislature says not to, because they were written into law. So that's part of it, is holding the legislature accountable. But it's also like, it feels like there could be a lot more done that's like, no, actually, you shouldn't try to take money away from active transportation projects. You should be realizing that we can't afford to be building billion-dollar freeway projects that won't solve our problems. Aaron, I'll let you do all your policy slides.
Well, this is a perfect segue to a comment that Madeline had in the chat about the, we've got so many different components, so we got to figure out what the transportation package. And I think she was asking they were asking about transit funding, and I would maybe kind of frame it sort of this way. We've been talking about how ODOT is broke, and we need to find sustainable revenue, and we need to fund all the backlog maintenance and safety needs, right? And that's this really quintessential, and that's going to be like the priority of like most of the legislature. And that, and candidly, some of the highway projects that we're still going to be trying to fight, like that is going to be the zeitgeist of the transportation package. And we are trying to, and by we, I mean Cassie and I and other advocates and other legislators, like there's a need to be thinking about the transportation system beyond just the backlogged ODOT needs. I mean, to be clear, that's a top priority by all means, but legislators are also skeptical of recognizing that it's hard to raise taxes, and you got to run good campaigns, and you got to make sure that people are, that I don't know if you've noticed, but our democracy doesn't function very well here in Oregon right now. You've got the ever-present threat of walkouts and shutdowns, and so there's a lot of anxiety about going too big and proposing something that's out of scope. But the more that we've talked to a lot of advocates, like the beautiful thing about transportation, this is my hokey, cheesy line, but like transportation is inherently what connects Oregonians to each other. And that like these transportation issues transcend urban and rural, Republican and Democratic divides. Like the notion that Cassie was just talking about, that like really basic maintenance transportation projects around the state might just not happen for 3 years just for a single Portland freeway project. Well, that's something that could like unite some of the most red counties and some of the most blue counties in the center of Portland that don't want these polluting freeways in their backyard, and the folks in rural areas that are wondering why they never get enough maintenance and why they don't have enough snowplows on their freeway, on their big highways over the mountain passes, right? Like there's unique opportunities here to sort of like revisit like our policy choices. And one of the big ones, probably the biggest intervention that we can make that's sort of in addition to that core of like the basic make ODOT solvent, is a dramatic increase in transit funding, and in particular for transit operations, which is to say that, at the end of the day, the thing that is proven to get most people, get more butts on buses, is when the bus shows up frequently, reliably, it's irresistible for people because they know that at any given moment they can walk down to the street and catch a bus that's going to take them where they need to go. It's not going to get stuck in traffic. They feel safe on it. It's reliable. It's never late. Those are things that we can have as a society if we invest in more transit service. You may have been paying attention to some of the conversations over the last couple of years about, Opal's, the Environmental Justice Oregon, has been heckling TriMet about raising fares, and those are, righteous causes. We need to be making sure that transit is affordable. But to be at least a little bit sympathetic to TriMet, I mean, they should be looking at, affordable, looking at their pennies and dollars. But at the end of the day, these transit agencies are getting money from the state. That is overwhelmingly where the funding comes from that runs these transit services. And the best thing we could do is to get TriMet a heck of a lot more money so that those buses are running every 5 minutes. And that, we want to be creating a system where, and this is an urban and a rural issue, right? So the funding for the transportation package, or for in House Bill 2017, there was a employee payroll tax. So, your employer right now, if you're employed in the state of Oregon, like deducts a certain amount of your paycheck and puts it directly to the state. If you're a contractor, then you get to write that check yourself separately. But that money is going towards this funding for the 23 transit agencies across the state of Oregon, and it's been a critical lifeline. Because outside of TriMet and Chariots and Salem and Eugene, most of these transit agencies were just barely getting by, and many of them were suffering dramatically. So House Bill 2017 had put down the keep the transit agencies across the state alive funding. And now all these transit agencies are getting a bunch of riders. And these are, in rural areas, this is like low income. These are seniors trying to get to healthcare in the town, three towns over, right? There's so many people that I think a lot of legislators in rural areas don't recognize. I mean, during the 2017 roadshow process, legislators were astounded to see just how many people were riding these buses, and that these buses were people's access to healthcare. And, when you start getting healthcare involved, then suddenly things get so much cheaper if you can just count on someone being able to get to the doctor's office without having to send a healthcare, a Medicare paid for van to pick somebody up, right? And so there's all these ways that dramatically increasing transit service is, I like to think of public transit as sort of like the Green New Deal. It's the Medicare for all of transportation, which is to say it's the public option, right? It is the thing that the government is saying, here's your government provided mobility that provides your basic needs. And no matter where you live, there's going to be a public investment in getting you where you need to go safely and conveniently. And so similar to how making a really dramatically awesome, badass public option that works for urban and rural communities across the state would be amazing for public health, having a baseline level of public commitment to funding transit, and particularly just bus service most of the time, is really the bread and butter of our system. I can go to the next slide. And it's not just intercity buses, or it's not intracity buses, it's about intercity passenger rail as well. And what I love about this is that passenger rail is another great example of how transportation creates all sorts of unique bedfellows. Tomorrow morning, there's an event happening in the building with Cassie and I are going to it super early in the morning. We've got multiple Republicans that are going to be coming and speaking at the Enviro Caucus, including one of them who's going to be talking exclusively about how much he loves passenger rail. I am a young white guy. There's a lot of old white guys. And one thing, as a future old white guy, I love trains. And I will tell you that I have been able to bond with a lot of Republican legislators about how much they wish that there was just a train running throughout the Willamette Valley on an hourly basis. That is fundable. That is totally something we could do. The reason we haven't done it is that trains on the train railroad system is largely managed through ODOT, which as a state agency just has not prioritized or truly invested in like aggressively pursuing what the investments would look like. There's a ton of federal money sitting around in the IIJA and the IRA bill just waiting for better investment in our passenger rail. And we just need to make sure that this next transportation package is not only setting aside some state money to pursue these investments, but is also putting money into setting up a state agency that we spin off from ODOT so that, we have a state agency where staffers, we have FTE that are actively pursuing making sure that we're moving forward with rail and that it doesn't just get buried in reports and stuff. We should be talking about a passenger rail system in the Willamette Valley. There's free federal money out there to bring back the Pioneer route, which was the Amtrak line between Portland and Boise. Like literally free federal money to start studying to bring that. And we had to like pass writer language in a bill in that short session to just direct ODOT to write the letter to ask for that federal funding, right? Like we need to get a federal government or we need to have a state entity that is aggressively pursuing this on its own. And what routes make sense and stuff, that's a purview of a ton of urban planners, but we need to start just getting a government apparatus that's truly interested in answering that question.
Well, and just to add to that, yeah, I was talking to somebody earlier who does a lot of work on the coast, and they were like, people there's like the scenic train on the coast that every summer it's completely full because people are so enthused about trains. And in general, yeah, trains, passenger rail, like it's one of the easiest things to connect with people on, and it's like every corner of the state people want more. I'm also part of an advisory committee that's going to be bringing back the conversation about extending the TriMet's West train to Salem. Whenever I say west to Salem, it sounds like West Salem, and that's not helpful. But the West train to Salem. So there's definitely a lot of conversations about happening around rail, which is exciting because in 2017 that really wasn't the case. So a lot of possibilities there.
We've talked about this a lot, but just to reiterate, spending as much money as possible on sidewalks, on traffic calming on busy streets, on making it easier for schools to organize bike buses like this amazing photo we have here. I think we're all on the same page about it. We don't need to talk too much more about it, but I think recognizing that we have a responsibility to fully fund ODOT's Safe Routes to School program, the one that Cassie was mentioning previously. It is 3 times oversubscribed. At minimum, we should be tripling the amount of money going into Safe Routes to just make sure that like every community across the state that wants help. We should also be getting more money into the hands of more local government. It's really great when ODOT's helping a rural small town that maybe doesn't have a ton of urban planners. In the Portland region, Metro has a really amazing, robust Safe Routes to School program. ODOT doesn't need to be planning safe routes in the Portland region. They should just give money to Metro that's already doing it, right? And safe routes, I'll just say, safe routes is like the ultimate Trojan horse in terms of getting a lot of boomers excited about walkable communities because they love, what do older folks always tell younger folks? Like, oh, when I was your day, I used to walk to school up hills in the snow both ways, right? Like there's such a visceral memory a lot of older folks have. And then they're like, well, why don't you kids walk to school? And I'm like, well, your crappy land use patterns and, lack of funding for sidewalks. And people just love making investments. And there's all sorts of quantitative research out there that shows the dramatic improvements that happen actually to education scores because kids are getting exercise, because kids are able to guarantee that they are able to access school, that if, they can reliably get to school, whether or not a parent is present for them, right? Like that's a huge barrier for many folks in finishing their degrees. And traffic fatalities are also up 70% from 2010 to 2022. That's the stat that I keep trying to use and reinforce. Part of that's because cars are getting bigger. Part of that's because of distracted driving. But a lot of it is also just that we haven't fully fleshed out building safer streets. This whole presentation has been focused on we need to reduce driving, and of course we do. But also we need to make sure that we are robustly filling up the rebate program for electric cars. The one that existed previously in 2021, 2023, also went fully, like everyone went for it and suddenly it was out of money. There's a huge demand for the switch to electrification. And my only thing to that is let's make sure that there's money for e-bikes in there as well, because e-bike subsidies are enormously popular. A tiny amount of money goes a very long way in terms of getting people on bikes that they may not otherwise purchase. And once they're on an e-bike, suddenly they're driving a lot less. So I don't know if Cassie, if you have anything to say about either of these, but I think that, really recognizing that I think the slide that Cassie had at the beginning of our first goal is to reduce driving as much as possible. And then the second goal is to electrify as much driving as possible. There's some really tricky policy questions here, both in terms of, okay, is it better if you have one nominal dollar, how much money goes towards rebating EVs versus building, communities that don't need cars whatsoever? There's also the reality if we're raising revenue, if we're trying to have like a road user fee or something, well, in one way we want to be encouraging people to switch to electric, but also like there's certain types of taxation that might put too heavy of a toll on electric vehicles that discourage people from buying them, right? So it's really threading a needle where we are making sure we're not just giving cars to everybody, including people that don't want them, but that we're also making sure that these subsidies are targeting the communities that need them most, and we're not just making it easier for a very wealthy person to just get a Tesla just because they want one.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I would add is when I was doing research on 2017, one of the interesting things I learned as somebody who doesn't own an electric car is the discrepancies in access to charging infrastructure, not necessarily just access to it, but the type of charging infrastructure. I guess certain chargers charge faster. And so, but there's like a price difference in being able to access those. And so making sure that people aren't getting like a time tax of having to wait longer or having a longer wait while their car charges, just because they can't afford the more expensive charger. And I think in general, like, yeah, just making sure there's a lot of like equity standards as we move forward.
Goes without saying, building a lot of this stuff, it's going to take a lot of jobs. As environmentalists, we have a really important responsibility to be thinking both morally and politically about building the durable, sustainable coalition that makes sure that this stuff gets built and continues to get built and managed into the future. I have a lot to learn. I've spent a lot of time in the last couple of years. I've worked on the regional transport. I've been trying over the last couple of years to make a very concerted effort to engage with as many folks in the building trades as possible. And to be clear, when we talk about green jobs, build a green economy, bus drivers, and there's plenty of caretaking, types of labor unions that also dramatically benefit from transit. But just to talk specifically about the dudes in hard hats, or at least the unions that are typically thought of as dudes in hard hats, there's a profound opportunity for us to be building the alliances. In the state of Washington, I believe it's 80% of the jobs created by their state DOT are represented by labor unions. In Oregon, it's closer to 30. I mean, that's embarrassing for a blue state. Like, we have a lot of work to do, and a lot of it is because we haven't been building the durable coalitions. And a lot of the labor unions do at times want to support projects that we as environmentalists would oppose in terms of like large highway projects. And so a lot of it is finding ways that we are, proposing alternative versions. And it's about making sure that not just the highway projects, but that the sidewalk projects are also being built by labor standards, right? It's a matter of really tracking why at every level of where these transportation investments, how can we encourage and create not just, standards, but floors, mandating that across the state in as many places as possible and as many communities as possible, that we were approaching this trying to create jobs from these investments, right? And additionally, bus drivers are like the epitome of a Green New Deal job as far as I'm concerned.
And like I would say part of that too, one of the things I have learned again in I learned so much in my research. I'll share my report in Discord after this. But one of the things I was learning is that like in certain parts of the state, for example, it's actually like harder to find somewhere that'll give you like a commercial driver's license test and training and all of that. And so it's like making sure that every piece of the puzzle is there to make like getting good green union jobs like as easy as possible, and identifying where those where any barriers are and removing them, so that way we can make it as easy as possible for folks.
This is one of the more minor components of the transportation package that we're sort of pursuing, but I want to include it here because it's really focused on, it's one of the more major climate components aside from all of the other stuff that is implicitly climate. Minnesota and Colorado have passed, one through technical and the other through the legislative, but they've passed bills essentially saying that every transportation package or every transportation project that they start after a certain date from here on out has to be evaluated as to whether or not it increases greenhouse gases emissions or not, which seems totally reasonable and is totally radical in the grand context of how state TOTs operate across the country. We're hoping to bring some of the legislators that were involved in that to Oregon in different contexts. We're engaging with the Rocky Mountain Institute and others that were involved in helping pass that stuff. And even the Minnesota bill isn't even saying if you study a transportation project and it increases emissions, the bill doesn't even say you can't build it, but it does say you have to invest in offsets, which I know how we largely feel about offsets on aggregate, but I will tell you that telling people, okay, you're going to widen that freeway, well, you're going to have to spend an extra $20 million on investments in safe routes to school and transit in that neighborhood. It is, it makes the project more expensive, which makes it less likely to happen. And B, if it does happen, you are providing new critical revenue for these really important projects in neighborhoods and communities. So, figuring out how to get this as part of the transportation package next year is one of the top, I think, environmental victories, at least policy procedural victories. I think transit is the biggest victory, but we've been saying it, but for those that have taken econ classes, right? Like we have to be thinking about this from a, like, what are the incentives, right? If we just have a gas tax, if we were to just dramatically increase the gas tax, well, A, would be getting people off of gas cars really quick, but that'd be pretty inequitable. B, if we're putting in a road user fee, well, we got to navigate how that impacts rural communities versus urban communities where people are driving much more versus driving much less. But any revenue that we should be setting up should be trying to discourage driving, because that is the best way to get people to sort of respond to these incentives and to be creating revenue that we can then be spending on alternatives to driving, right? So making it slightly more expensive to drive at the peak time on the busiest roads and making it slightly easier and cheaper and more efficient to take a bus at that time, on broad aggregate, like we want to be approaching, from that perspective. We don't want to be implicitly subsidizing more driving.
Speaking of what other states are trying in terms of that, greenhouse gas emissions study requirement. And speaking of revenue sources, I looked at what Minnesota, Colorado, and Washington have done in their most recent transportation packages, and some examples of funding mechanisms that they included retail delivery fees, which specifically had carve-outs to protect, being able to get groceries, medicine, things like that, delivered, not carve-outs, safeguards. Ride-hailing fees, Washington's got a cap and invest carbon pricing program. I think it was Minnesota that indexed their gas tax to inflation, and they also did an urban sales tax to fund transit. And then Washington made transit free for youth across the state, and Minnesota started a pilot program for free transit for seniors and people with disabilities. Washington included a bicycle education program for in schools in Washington, so that's very cool because we've seen some similar efforts through Safe Routes to School programming here, but it's really depends where you're at and where you have a Safe Routes to School coordinator, and the capacity and bikes and infrastructure to do that. Minnesota also included specific funding for social workers on transit to increase transit safety, and then lots of conversations about greenhouse gas and vehicle miles traveled reduction requirements. I also remembered Washington in theirs had a requirement that I believe it's for projects over 500, costing over $500,000, that there's a complete streets requirement, making sure that all modes of transportation are fully taken into consideration, and that it's not just, some mega project that moves cars faster, and that it actually makes transportation better for everyone. So that brings us to where we're at now, which actually, let me, well, I don't know. I'm like, I don't care about the order of my slides. We'll get to all of it eventually, I guess. But basically, 1000 Friends is part of a statewide campaign organizing around the 2025 package, because we need it to be so much more than just filling the gaps in ODOT's budget, and we need it to really not be them just funding freeways. And so on screen right now is just some kind of very high level view of the platform that we've put together around safety, climate, fair funding, and accountable governance. We still have a lot of work to do on figuring out what our actual policy and revenue proposals are and what we specifically want to see, but we know that we need a transportation system that is safer for people outside of cars, and well, and technically for people in cars, safer for everyone, really. And one that is so much better for climate, on electrification, transit, land use, housing, all of the things. Fair funding, we want to make sure that, whatever finance mechanisms come out of this next package aren't disproportionately harming low-income communities, or just, disproportionately harming any marginalized communities for that matter. And also making sure that we're actually stabilizing and diversifying funding, where we're not, 8 years from now having the same panic of the state running out of transportation money. And then accountable governance, which kind of speaks back to that greenhouse gas study rule, and just the policy levers that we can pull to make sure that that any new funding that is created is going towards projects that are good for people and the planet. And so the Joint Committee on Transportation from the legislature is going on a statewide listening tour starting next week in Portland on Tuesday. Tuesday's listening session is 5 to 7 p.m., but note that testimony sign-up starts at 4:30 at PCC Cascades in North Portland. There is an option for to do audio, virtual testimony, but I'm almost certain that won't happen for the Portland date, because in-person testimony will be taken first, and there's a little less than 2 hours of time for testimony. And so even if you narrow that, if it was just if it was the standard 3 minutes, that's still less than 60 people. There'll likely be more than 60 people there, plus I'm assuming testimony will be cut down in time to 1 or 2 minutes. Although, Aaron, do you know more about plans around what the chairs are thinking about cutting time?
Nope.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Again, like I said at the beginning of this presentation, of just trying to work within a system that isn't designed for meaningful engagement. And if you're like, whoa, why am I just hearing about this tour? Well, people like me and Aaron are advocates are the only ones promoting this at all. The legislature is not promoting that they're doing this at all. So that's that is the current status quo. And Aaron, do you know more about the Sunrise Rally, or other than just show up at 4 p.m. if you want to join?
That's as much as I think they've come up with at this point.
Okay.
Yeah, if folks are interested, if folks are unable to attend, there's always the opportunity to submit written email. I know that No More Freeways will have a comment generator prepared, and I imagine the Move Oregon Forward folks will as well.
Yeah, and with email, as far as I understand, based on how it's written online, you'll have 48 hours after, um, basically you'll have until June 6th at 5 p.m. to submit written and have it included as part of the record from that meeting. So encourage you to, but you can start emailing it in right now if you want. So encourage you to get it in sooner rather than later, so that way it's included as part of the record, because then when the people who are doing my job 8 years from now are being like, what happened in the last transportation package, then and they go back and look at old testimony, then they'll be able to see our comments. And I don't know, I just think being on the record is a good thing, to be able to hold people accountable, to know we've been saying this the whole time, and to just show numbers and strength across the state, about wanting better investments in the community. So please, even if you do show up and give testimony in person, please also submit written, because otherwise people would have to go through and watch the whole recording. And there may be like legislators and their staff who aren't on the committee, or who just generally want to go back and read through what people said, and aren't going to sit through and watch the 2-hour meeting. So definitely also submit written, even if you give comments in person. And then I just wanted to share this slide from last night. We had a campaign briefing, which I will also share our testimony guide and everything in the Discord afterwards. So that way you have those resources available if you're interested in giving testimony. But we had some just pointers for next week, because like I said, there will definitely be like almost certainly be more people than there will be time to give testimony. Consider if there's somebody in your life or that you organize with in general that is very directly like disadvantaged by our current transportation system, like making space to uplift their stories, than like if you're someone like me who is constantly like testifying on these issues, and you know, the legislators and all the transportation people in power know my name and face at this point. Like uplifting people whose stories aren't always heard by people in power would be great. And then similarly, because of the capacity issues, if you're part of an organization, I really recommend putting forward like one messenger to represent your organization, because the chairs are unlikely to pick multiple people from the same organization anyway. And also, we're more powerful when we can show that like we have people from all sorts of organizations and backgrounds advocating for the same thing. So like we've got, you know, advocates on food justice, food insecurity, like who are excited to show up next week, because transportation is important to having access to food. So like just as an example of like the diversity of backgrounds that that will be coming to the table on this. And then we haven't really touched as much on this specifically, but this is one of those beautiful moments where we get to like show up and share the vision of the transportation system we actually want to see. We don't have to show up and oppose something yet, because the package doesn't exist yet. The bills haven't been written yet. We can show up and be like, no, this is what we want to see. This is what my community needs. This is what my experience with the transportation system is. And so I think really the best thing that you can do is show up, share your personal story with the transportation system and what you need for it to work better for you, and your community. That's ultimately what's going to resonate the most. You know, I could throw statistics and, you know, actual like concrete factual information at them all I want to, but I think that like the things that stick most with people are when you tell that personal story of like, hey, like I couldn't get where I needed to go because there weren't the transportation options. I think those types of things resonate a lot more. Um, yeah, I think just generally personal stories really resonate. I've had a lot of conversations with like Republican elected officials who could not care less about talking about climate, but they're like, oh, our transportation system has failed people who can't drive. We should probably do something about that. And so it's like, it, like Aaron was saying earlier, like there's this issue really, it affects everyone because we all use transportation, and because so much of the state can't or doesn't drive, like pretty much everyone knows somebody who is affected by that. So I guess Aaron, did you have any other advice you would give um for prepping for next week?
No, I mean, thank you all for sitting through this presentation. I mean, Cassie and I can talk about this stuff for hours, and it's lovely to know that folks want to listen to us talk about it. You know, if you're able to make it on Tuesday, would love to have your voices there. If you're not able to make it, you should consider joining Khan's list. Here's a wonderful little QR code. List building, always be list building. But Rep Pham is going to be using, you know, her legislative office. I mean, she's set aside capacity just to bring me on, just to help with the transportation package. So, you know, she's taking it really seriously, and we're you know, scheming to find ways to collaborate with legislators across the building, across the state. I would say, if you can't make it on Tuesday, definitely submit written testimony, as Cassie said. I would also say that, you know, well, please do that if you can over the next week. You know, this transportation package is going to be something that's done over the next year, which is to say that, you know, I see some names of folks I recognize here, and, you know, would love to have housing advocates. We didn't really talk a ton about, I mean, we talked a little bit about just the implicit connections of housing and transportation, but, you know, I think the governor's office and I think Speaker Fahey, we have a lot of legislators that love to talk about housing policy right now, and making them understand that the transportation reforms that we're talking about are part and parcel with reforms that allow for more housing to get built. You know, we didn't talk about it in the context of this package of this, you know, conversation here, but you know, the most expensive part about building housing is the parking minimums. Creating circumstances where we don't have to build tons and tons of parking is one in which we can build, and developers, both market rate and affordable housing, can build a ton more housing. And, you know, a world in which affordable housing providers are, you know, lining up units at various levels of MFI on busy roads that have that are walkable and have transit every 5 minutes. I mean, that is a critical opportunity to address all of our goals with climate, with housing, and transportation. And so, you know, I just sort of want to throw out there that whatever flavor of an environmentalist you are, however you've come to the meet with, you know, join Nick's class and learn about all this stuff, like whether, you know, there's conservation components to all of this as well that we haven't really talked about. There's so many different ways to engage with this transportation package, and whatever organization you're with, I think Cassie and I mean, your organization should join the Move Oregon Forward coalition space that is officially launching next week that Cassie is part of. And B, we should find ways to tailor some of the specific messages about transportation reform as it engages with, you know, your particular organization or your background.
Which, yeah, on that note, I have my email on this slide, and I'll include it again when I post in Discord after this. But I'm like happy to support anyone who needs someone to review testimony or just get advice on what to talk about, or just any way that I can support you showing up next week, or in written comment, or anytime over the next year. Feel free to reach out. This is going to be mostly all I'm working on for the next year. So happy to support in any way I can.
Thanks all. That was great. Yeah, we've got a little bit of time for questions for Aaron and Cassie, if you like, or anything else that you want to wrap up around the class. So yeah, speak up now or forever hold your peace. You'll never ever get an opportunity to talk to any of us again. So you better say it now. The comment. Presence of, okay, here's a question. Are there incentives for low-income communities, blue-collar workers, most of who are driving gas and diesel-powered vehicles for work, to switch to more expensive yet greener-powered vehicles? It would seem inequitable to tax them on gas use when there are no alternative affordable options. I'm thinking truck drivers who transport goods throughout our region, but also cause lots of pollution. Most own or lease their own trucks, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that those are, exactly the kind of folks that we hope to target with subsidies for, electrification that, again, are not at this point, to my knowledge, being included as sort of like the baseline transportation package. But, having tens of millions or, some significant amount of funding to really target the investments of the electrification subsidies would make a huge difference.
Yeah, this is like, I feel like, do you remember during the pandemic when the PPP loans were going out? Okay, I'm gonna just talk out of my ass for a sec, and maybe somebody knows more than what I know about this, but a lot of those loans were sought by small business owners, and then they were basically forgiven. And it was kind of like a inside track, like they're playing inside baseball with like small business owners. Like everybody who got those loans kind of knew they weren't going to have to pay them back somehow. And all these other classes of people didn't really understand that, like me, for example, and other people who just don't think like that. But it turned out to be the subsidy. And like right around the same time, all these new like giant shitty pickup trucks started hitting the road. And if you look really closely, a lot of those would have like a small business decal on it. And so I have a strong suspicion that the PPP loans ended up being like a subsidy for like these pickup trucks and stuff. And anyway, this is all to say that like the government can fund this, right? Like and prioritize it. The federal government definitely can, but also state government. We've had things like diesel change out programs in the state already. And now with like drayage trucks, which are the trucks that drive like from the port to like a shipping center, like there are becoming electric alternatives to those sorts of things. So I think you're spot on, Samuel, that like this is about like priority setting in policy making and making sure that there's not just kind of like a class of like white business owners that kind of like know that they're going to get a tax cut or know that they're going to get a loan forgiveness and that these benefits are extended more broadly in society.
Yeah, I echo everything Nick said. I mean, there's so much government subsidy, and I mean, one of the many lessons of COVID was just the recognition that the government has immense wealth and power, does not always have capacity. The capacity needs to be built up because the government capacity that exists is usually for schmucks with guns as opposed to actually healthcare or people that we actually need. But recognizing that, these transportation package, this is an opportunity for us to be building the state capacity we need. Jumping into the next question here, Mary had something talking about intersectional transportation. Talk about how it informs our advocacy. For example, she wrote her undergrad thesis on the relationship between food insecurity and transit access. These intersectional ideas ended up leading to a free bus system, woohoo, but do we see that kind of intersectional push in Oregon? What does it look like? Curious to hear your experiences. I would say, Mary, that there's a lot of people that are thinking about a lot of this sort of stuff. And there's a lot of people that if our organizations had a lot more resources, we would be doing a lot more of this stuff. And I actually just took a call from Partnership for Hunger Free Oregon, who's going to be testifying at the hearing on next Tuesday. There are people that are recognizing, I mean, there's a lot of causes that people don't realize are transportation issues, like reproductive justice. Like the biggest thing that Planned Parenthood finds as a barrier is who can get a ride, right? Like there's a lot of stuff that the questions of who has access to mobility, who is able to get places affordably, reliably, independently, these break down along these really predictable lines. And I think that, I can just speak from my own personal experience that, as somebody that grew up in the suburbs of Portland and was nerding out about transit maps and came back to Portland after college and thought I wanted to be, an urban planner and want to, be a Portlandia bike hipster, whatever. I mean, I'm still riding my bike sometimes, but just recognizing the sheer vast ways in which how we move through our communities is so deeply connected to so many other systems of liberation and oppression. And the more that I, explore, why do I have an emotional attachment to this automobile that I have? Or like, why am I frustrated at the thought of having to pay a toll when I drive a car, even though like there's a massive toll in terms of air pollution that someone else is paying when I drive a car, right? Like, why is it that automobiles are being used as new violent weapons in attacking protesters on the roads, right? I mean, this we're fundamentally talking about what's left of the public right of way in America, the public space, and demanding our current world expects us to own and operate a 1.5 ton piece of machinery for $60,000 and mortgage our communities on. Like every ounce of it is absurd for climate, for justice in any possible lens. And I think Cassie's got some more to say about this, so I'll let her answer it. But I just say that I've just been really heartened to find ways in which the transportation conversation can be reframed as a health justice conversation, as an economic justice conversation, as a climate justice conversation. There's just so many different lenses that people can bring to this. And once you just add this question of mobility for who has what right to move in what capacity, how does it harm and hinder other people, how is it subsidized, who pays for it? These are very basic questions, but if you really start asking them, you really tease out like so many other forms of fucked upness that we're navigating in American society.
Yeah, I mean, I think you covered a lot of it, but I think just echoing the point of like, I think the times that the like the times that overlapping issues have come together, I think on transportation specifically, I think comes from when groups outside of just solely focused ones focused just on transportation. I think it's when like climate groups started to care about transportation, and then it started to overlap. And so it's like, I think, which comes back to Aaron's point about like there's just straight up not enough time and resources right now for like, I like this is something I'm constantly thinking about. And it's like also like in these heightened times of like, oh, we need people to like show up and testify. It's like pretty terrible time to try to build like trust in a relationship like within the span of a few days. Like it just doesn't happen overnight. And so it's like that's I think totally part of the longer term thing. And I think, we've been very successful on the climate front. I think housing absolutely needs to be part of like the next month. I didn't even see like the partnerships for Hunger Free Oregon was such like an unexpected, joyful like thing to hear the other day, because I was just like, yes, like this is the exact type of like collaborations that we do need, but it absolutely just comes down to like having the time and resources to do it, because within every issue there's so much going on already, but then at the overlaps there are too. So it's like taking any opportunity where when it presents itself to build on that. And Aaron and I are doing some work around building bridges between the disability justice community and transportation spaces. So it's like there's just some long-term movement work that has to happen.
I mean, it's notable that the metaphor we use to talk about movement is movement, right? And I'm just gonna throw some attention and accolades towards Cassie, but I remember the first time her and I met and talked about transportation and climate stuff 3 years ago, and which is horrifying and terrifying to think of how much you've learned and now know more than anybody in this whole state about this stuff, Cassie. So Jesus, it leaves some room for the rest of us. But Cassie was reaching out to talk about transportation and climate stuff, and I was like, I actually don't think I have anything to teach you about like mobility questions. Like I think that this concept of like movement and autonomy and whether the government is allowing people to be able to move around freely and under what circumstances, I think you have a lot more to teach me than I have to teach you about any of this. And I think that just recognizing that there is such that people have transportation stories to share, and it's as a quick aside too, you ever watch like the local news or the Super Bowl and all you see are television commercials for automobiles, like big, gnarly automobiles, oftentimes ones that are asserting masculinity or sexuality and power and class and rugged control over that's like all the Don Drapers of the world. The entire industry of the American advertising world is set up mainly to just sell us automobiles. Like we like, and I increasingly like driving under certain circumstances when I'm not in traffic, whatever. But like, just recognizing that, like, I'm not going to call us all brainwashed, because I think that's unfair to, like, erase sort of the autonomy that many of us have. But we live in a society that we are perpetually bombarded with messages of the automobile equaling freedom. And we literally call them freeways, right? I mean, like, every ounce of how we think about and talk about these things is so colored by these implicit assumptions that this is how it has to be, that this is how we're going to subsidize what our communities look like, who is going to pay what burdens, et cetera. And the more that we're able to provide opportunities for people to reflect honestly on what their lives are like, and man, I really would like to be able to walk my kids to school, and man, it would be great if didn't ever have to worry about traffic fatalities. I think that it's worth just pointing out how much of the American economy is based on motordom, but also all of the ways that people are suffering because of it.
Yeah, I wanted to also add that I have this like pre-pandemic nostalgia thing that I've been doing a lot during this class, to be like, oh, the movements were so strong. It's my like old man looking back on things refrain, but it's about power, right? Like, and using power. And the commissioner that I worked for, Chloe Daly, for a while, they almost like expecting her not to do anything with it. Mayor Wheeler gave her the Transportation Bureau at one point, and they were like, all right, like, let's go out and like do the Rose lanes. And like, there were pretty active campaigns for free public transit, and like creating like classes of free public transit. And the pandemic did a lot to harm public transit. First, because like nobody was riding it for a long time, and it created this like culture of fear around it and things like that. But so that's starting to fade. And so like with a lot of topics that we've been talking about, like as the distance from the pandemic goes, like it's time for movements to like jump back in and start taking their power again. And so I'm so happy that Aaron and Cassie are in the I don't know what metaphor you want to use here. I was going to say driver's seat, but that's not one. And the bicycle and yeah, whatever other like non-motorized transportation you're using at this point, seat in these campaigns. In the bike lane, yeah.
Or the train conductors. Let's see, question in the chat regarding concerns about subsidizing electric vehicles because of the inequity involved in the extraction of rare earth metals needed to electrify them. Can free fares and public transit incentivize the infrastructure for expanding larger capacity vehicles instead of electrifying the current single passenger fleet first? I guess like my first thought on this would be that I think that one's not happening before the other. Everything's happening at once because we need to move as quickly as possible to reduce emissions. But I mean, that's something I think about a lot with like why reducing driving has to be part of how we reduce emissions because of the international impacts and inequities that come with electrification and where we're sourcing things from. Aaron?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the most efficient way to be minimizing our rare earth metals is to get as many 60 people riding on a bus with a battery as opposed to 3 people in a car, right? I'll also say too, I mean, the second part you were asking about free fares. There's sort of a really annoying debate about free transit from people that are really pedantic about it. And by that I mean that there are some people out there that are like really loudly insisting that the number one thing we need to do is to make transit free. And then there are other people who are pointing out that in many, every transit agency is funded differently across the country, but like some places transit funding, the fare box revenue is a really large percentage. So if you made transit free, then suddenly there would be no money for transit. And I think it's a really illuminating debate because it gets at like, on one hand, you've got folks that are really approaching transit like from an abolitionist perspective of like, well, if it's free, then no cop is going to arrest somebody on the bus, and that libraries are free and no one ever complains about that, right? And I think that there's a lot to that, but I will say also that if you had to choose, if you were somebody who lived in East Portland and you didn't have a car and you needed to get to the grocery store and you had to take a transfer to get to that grocery store, you're many studies suggest that those folks will happily spend $2 on a bus that shows up every 5 minutes than a free bus that shows up once an hour, right? And obviously that's a very egregious hyperbolic example, but I guess, and you might have been talking more just about public transit broadly than specifically about free fares, but I bring that up just to say that like we should absolutely be trying to make transit free for young folks, for students. I think for veterans, for old folks, we should have a lot of categories of folks. For low income folks, we should be trying to keep transit fares affordable and free for many protected classes. But we shouldn't necessarily be afraid to charge people a couple bucks, especially if it means that that's providing the funding that makes transit functional and gets more people involved. And I would say, of course, like we can have people check fares without guns, right? like it could be the equivalent of getting a parking ticket. It doesn't have to be, I mean, an opportunity to engage somebody into the carceral system, right? And again, that's not to say that we shouldn't be thinking about a fareless future someday, as much as to say that like I've seen two well-meaning but increasingly pedantic sides of that hyperbolic argument ignore the fact that ultimately we just need to make transit something that is ubiquitous. And I personally don't believe that having people pay a couple bucks to ride transit is necessarily going to stop that from happening. And in fact, removing that might actually, in many cases, make it really hard to find the revenue necessary to keep transit going. And to your question, Sam, about just other countries, yeah, I mean, the Highway Trust Fund is not something that exists in other places, right? Like we have all these insane limitations on how we can spend money and on what. And American taxation is really hideous compared to a lot of places in the global north and south, but
Other last questions? Anybody want to take the honor of the last question of the class? You've always wanted to know. Sam Diaz asks, how's the package going to be put together? Who writes it?
good question. We're trying to figure it out. We will say that there's a lot of interest in this transportation package, and the co-chairs of the committee have been really holding on to a lot of the major decision making and are very slowly but steadily getting more opportunities for other legislators to get involved with the project and process. I think there's a recognition that in 2017 the transportation package was like a couple dudes got into a basement and then just doled out major projects in every district across the state and like called it a day. And I think that like to their credit, the presiding officers this year are really trying to say what are our values. Like the number one thing we need is a sustainable revenue stream for ODOT, and we need to make sure that ODOT is prioritizing maintenance and safety. How we can engage with that process is something that remains to be seen.
And I guess from an advocacy perspective, our view, even though it feels still not super tangible in terms of exactly like Aaron said, it's like who's actually writing this thing is like, we're like, if we come in with the revenue solutions and the policy, like if we come in with a full vision, but especially the revenue solutions, then it's harder for them to it's hard for the status quo to oppose that, because I think it's one thing to be like, you should spend on this, not that. But if you're not coming in with the revenue ideas as well, then it's easier to just be shut out. So it's like, how much of a complete vision can we come in with so that way we're given, I don't know, an actual shot at our ideas making it into whatever this thing turns out to be.
I mean, Sam, I have my version of a package that you saw the present slides here are iterations of it. And so I don't know if that's the package, but hopefully that's, we're really trying, as Cassie said, to just throw good ideas out there and demonstrate to the leadership at all these different levels that there's constituencies for these investments.
Whose computers? Well, all right. I think we're getting close to 7:30. Time to wrap up. Thanks everybody for a really fun class on my end. I sent out I'll send out another email with the video for this to the class, but there's like a feedback form. It's not super intensive, should be like 5 minutes, but would love to get feedback from folks on what you liked, what you didn't, what's missing, what you'd like to see in future movement education offerings. And yeah, I'll be gone on restorative leave in June. One of the perks of being in a worker self-directed unionized nonprofit, as we have stuff like that. But planning on doing stuff in the summer and in the fall as well. So if you're interested, we'll be there. And thanks again, Aaron and Cassie, for sharing your knowledge tonight. I learned a lot. I'm sure everybody else did, and the folks that are going to watch this on video later will learn a lot too. So yeah, I hope that we can get a bunch of people to help you in your efforts at the state legislature in the coming session. So thanks everyone.
Thanks, Nick.